Good evening. It almost seems untrue to say good evening because it's so bright outside given our daylight savings, but we're delighted that you have joined us via Zoom for our conversation tonight with Ellen O'Connell Whittet, who is an essayist and lecturer at UC Santa Barbara, winner of the Virginia Faulkner Award. Her work has appeared in The Atlantic, Vulture, Paris Review, BuzzFeed, Salon, and she is the author of the memoir, What You Become in Flight, which is her first book and the focus of our conversation this evening. Called revelatory, honest, and wondrous, elegant and compelling, piercing and poetic, this searingly beautiful debut evokes the universal while probing the personal. As always, we invite and encourage your questions throughout the evening, but we ask that you type them using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And we will read them, and Ellen will answer as many as time allows in the final 20 minutes of this hour together. And with those brief instructions and welcome, we ask you to consider together with us questions of self-worth, the desire to disappear, the loss and reclamation of our own voice, and what it feels like to look at a body and see a story. So welcome, Ellen.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're delighted to have you here. And I should also divulge that Ellen is one of our wonderful Writing in the Galleries and Writing from Home instructors. And it has been my great pleasure to get to know her through those programs over the last 2 years, I guess, or year and a half. And they have been just as powerful virtually as they are in person. So I thank you for that. And we're delighted to have you here this evening. And I thought you might start it off by reading something to kind of get us in the right groove.
Sure, yeah. So this is my book that I wrote. And I'm going to start off with something from the prologue. So what's happening in this is that I'm in a ballet rehearsal, and I think that the only thing that I need to say to catch anyone up is that the dancer that I was with, I call him Peter in this, which is not his real name, but don't tell anyone. So we are sort of mid-scene, but it's only a page in. I ran forward and stopped, doing the steps Peter was dancing just behind me a few counts before he did them. Peter was close by, but didn't quite touch me unless I leaned so far that he needed to catch me, or I turned so much that his hands would stop my waist, spinning me until I unfolded and caught the music with my body. Though witness to each other, our steps were not the same. Mine were a prologue to his. We were two birds flying next to each other, plunging in a compact series, never wandering apart or varying our distance from each other, but keeping our place in the sky. Stage right, the choreographer directed. Downstage, look at her. Keep your eyes on him as he runs from you. Now run to him. As a child, I had felt such joy and freedom when I danced, my limbs loose and always in the habit of pulling up and turning out. Dancing let me say something before I was any good at using words. That night in the studio, I tried to remember that, even though these days there was a tug in my hip flexor and a leg warmer wrapped around my tired left ankle. I followed the choreographer's instructions, running on the balls of my point shoes. Running in ballet is more like skimming the surface of the stage, the arms still positioned with care, the chest leading. We'd been rehearsing this scene all evening, a loop of runs and leaps, and I was feeling tired. Though he didn't look it, Peter, who had been catching me all night, was also likely exhausted. Still, I ran to him, pushing for energy that would allow me to skitter toward a man who was supposed to catch and lift me. There was one lift I spent the whole first half of the piece dreading, and the second half giddy from remembering. The lift began with me running toward him, and when he caught me, he'd flip me over one shoulder, behind his neck, and I came down over the other shoulder. When the lift went well, we looked at each other afterwards, each of us miracles who had thrown ourselves headlong into a piece of choreography, caring only that we didn't fall behind the music. That was my fault, he said to the choreographer when it didn't go as well. He took the blame each time. This time I came down clumsily, still half caught in his arms. The choreographer stopped the music, and as her back was turned, Peter said to me, Make sure your rib cage is facing me so I can get my arm underneath and grab you. He made a swinging motion with his arms, and I understood that I was the invisible shape he was cradling in his gesture. Time and time again, when a lift went wrong or our timing was not matched, he called the fault his and then privately told me what I should do differently. We rehearsed together after daily classes when we were sweaty from Grand Allegro and warmed up enough to try the lift full out. It required him to catch me mid-step, lift me upside down and backward all at once. When I was first learning the steps, I would watch videos of other girls who executed it perfectly, the absolute trust they had in their bodies to mold improbably with the male dancer and create a complementary moving shape. I had never been lifted upside down and backwards all at once before, and I did not know that it took two people to let one fall. In our rehearsal, we did the steps that led me to him. He ran away, he looked back, I ran to him. I would then jump and he would stop and catch me. That's what was supposed to happen. And like we had rehearsed so many times, I ran toward him and jumped, only to watch him as he continued forward, not stopping, leaving me behind mid-flight. And then I was falling, a low moving kite of music and bones of hitched breath. I held my breath during that moment when I had no control over our movement. Everything was up to Peter and the ballet and all the training I'd ever had. And the floor grew and grew until my straight arm hit it, then legs, and my hip that jutted from my black tights like some rare bird. As I rolled onto my back, I felt a fate worse than gravity.
Well, thank you for doing that reading and for so putting us in really the middle or the beginning and the most important piece of this story, which is the injury. In fact, listening to that, and I wasn't reading, I just was listening to have a different experience of it. There's so many words in that opening that are sort of prefiguring what follows. The idea of flight, the idea of falling, the idea of control, the idea of dependence on the male. There's the rapture, if I can use that word, that you feel in flight, and the sense of trust and confidence that's part of it. So I'm wondering, in terms of structure, you chose a kind of key moment to start the book, and you chose to do it in a prologue. What made you think of that in terms of structure?
I think that the best entry point for any story we tell is usually tension. I think my students like to start in the middle of action. They like to start like during the chase, but that can be really disorienting. So starting with the fall would be, I think, probably disorienting to readers to know who I am, what I care about, who else is in the room, what the room looks like, what's really at stake. But starting with tension, which is how much I want to get this right, how afraid I am of that particular lift, allows, I think, the book to open up with a sense of, what I'm scared of, what happens if I don't get the thing that I want the most. And I think that fall is sort of a really dramatic way to illustrate all of those things because I really wanted to be a ballet dancer. That's all I wanted for, the first half of my life, really. And those were not the things that my parents, who were very academic, wanted for me. So I think that it was a good way for me to show, I don't know, who I really was and why this all mattered so much, which is that my identity was tied up in whether I, made that lift or not. And I didn't, in a very dramatic way.
Something else that I noticed when you were reading that passage is the idea that you had watched over and over again other dancers doing that same choreography in what you described as perfectly. So in ballet, in a sense, are you recreating a language over and over again, or is there room for you to write a new sentence, if you will?
There is room to write a new sentence, but I think that takes a lot of maturity as a dancer to be able to add your own spin to things. I think that that's not something that's encouraged, especially for dance students. And the idea of writing your own story is interesting for a dancer because you really have so little control over the story you're telling. I mean, the choreographer is the one who writes it. So Yeah, it's interesting to think about authorship in dance because within certain constraints, I guess, you do have a way that you're saying something, but it is really hard to say something original. You're not given that kind of freedom or autonomy very often unless you're a choreographer.
And you and I have talked, and you write about body image being central to your story and also in a way to ballet. And recently, really in the last, seems like 2 weeks, there have been a number of articles that have come out in the New York Times and other publications about dancers during COVID and a change, a shift in their own sense of what they were willing to do for their own body, and how they started to question maybe the extremes to which ballet was asking them to go. I'm wondering if you could, because I think you've read them too, react a little bit to that part of the story and ballet, and then maybe talk a little bit about the interviews that you've been doing with dancers about these same questions.
Sure. Yeah, so there was that New York Times article, "What is a ballet body?" that came out, I think, last week that I read, and lots of people sent it to me because it's so much, along the lines that I think and wrote this book. And the question was really like, can this pandemic provide an opportunity for us to rethink what a body looks like when it's dancing? And sort of the idea behind it was that dancers right now are trying to, stay in shape. Dance is an interesting art form when it comes to labor, I think, because you don't truly ever have time off. Your time off is spent trying to maintain your skill so that you're really in performance shape when you come back. So that's a lot of unpaid labor that dancers have to do. So right now, the question for this New York Times article was whether dancers are really trying to become better artists or whether they're just trying to stay the same weight, which, as we know, is like pretty skeletal in a lot of cases. That is the predominant, ballet, especially aesthetic. So like, they interviewed a dancer who said something like, "I'm not going to be 94 pounds anymore." Um, One of the physical therapists I mean, that's like so horrifying to read an adult woman say that number. But one of the physical therapists at New York City Ballet said something like, "Well, these dancers, a lot of them have gained 5 pounds, but they look good, they look healthy." And I just was thinking, like, I don't know that that's the revolution we need, that we go from, like, I think that particular dancer actually gained 6 pounds, but that, making it into the triple digits as an adult woman is like the revolution that ballet really needs. But it is an interesting question about labor, body maintenance, hunger, starvation, all the things that we know dancers are probably feeling when they don't actually have they can't dance because they don't have the physical space to do it in a lot of instances. Like, I've been seeing on Instagram dancers dancing at their kitchen counters or, on their balconies or whatever. So they have this tiny little confined space like we all do. They can't do the, big jumps, the grand allegro, the turns, the things that really, are athletic that we associate with performance. So yeah, so they're gaining weight like we all are, from being confined. And I think really, I mean, the article goes into a lot more things that would be a more useful conversation for us to have, like race, in ballet, especially, which is just has a huge race problem. It's an extreme, I mean, it's like a European aristocratic art form. So that was really baked into the aesthetic from the beginning. But then also the idea of being too muscular, which is actually quite tied to race. There are dancers who are, in major companies who are afraid of having bulky muscles, because that's what is associated with, you know, like if they're the one person of a non-white race in these companies, they feel like they have to represent an entire race, which is an awful thing to put on them. So I think, I was reading there was a dancer who was afraid of bulking up, so had always avoided the gym, and yet had to stay in shapes, or how do you do that without being able to dance? So I think it brought up a lot of really interesting points about what dancers are thinking about and how they're working right now, in really impossible conditions. And that it's not their failure. It's really a failure of the art form to have any kind of greater imagination.
I think that's a really interesting point, that from what you write and also what this article has said, that there's a lot of self-recrimination and a sense of not being good enough to not fit a script that perhaps should no longer apply.
Mm.
And it's interesting that in solitude, these dancers are coming up with a sense that things need to change. And I wonder if they'll have the power to do that, or if that lies more with the choreographers or I don't even know what the administration is behind a ballet company, but it's exciting to think that perhaps something could change and not just remain beautiful, but perhaps gain beauty.
Yeah, I mean, ballet is just so far behind the rest of the world, like so many elite art forms are. It's got a lot of gatekeepers that are really, really invested in keeping it a certain way, because without it, they would really lose their power. So yeah, I hope it changes. It's hard. It's hard. I sort of feel like I've heard it before. I've read this kind of article so many times, and I'll, believe it when I see it. But I hope, there's so much that I think COVID could teach us, and I hope that's one thing that ballet learns.
You mentioned the idea of power and trust, and that's something that comes up a lot in the book. And you talk about the fact that that power is generally wielded by males, from the stories told to the actual movements of the dance, the choreographer. And you write, the plots of ballets, she recalls, gave her a vocabulary for helplessness, for dependence on a man saving me before I could write. More generally, ballet excuses and glorifies a culture of dancing through pain and relies on women's bodies to be the tools of its expression. And you write, it never occurred to me that ballet's logic was flawed. Instead, I believed my body was. So taking that on as if somehow you were responsible. Can you talk a little bit more about that idea of somehow maybe the necessity of pain and the power that has traditionally lain in the hands of a male?
Yeah, I mean, ballet logic is really easy to get sucked back into, I think. Even thinking about the ways that I hurt myself or danced through pain, I just think, well, yeah, that was a necessity. I had a performance coming up. And I think that I was always hyper aware that there was somebody else who could have stepped in, that I was never worth that much. Which is a really weird way to come of age, to think about your own worth as being like, really dependent on you being able to just push through a lot of pain. But there's always somebody else who can step in. I mean, that's no big deal, especially I think for girls and women in ballet. You really feel like you're kind of a dime a dozen, maybe less so with especially boys in ballet classes. But yeah, I mean, I wrote in the book about a number of injuries that I sustained that just felt necessary. It's like, ballet logic says that you have to have hyperextended legs, you have to have long legs, you have to have a small head, you have to have what we call banana feet, which are, feet that curve like bananas. You have to have turnout, you have to have, whatever, elegant upper body, port-de-bras. But in order to achieve a lot of those things, like especially turnout, turnout comes from your hips, but really no one's hips rotate to a 90-degree, flat line. So you do have to tweak your knees and your ankles a little bit. And it just feels like, well, yeah, that's the logic of ballet. I know what it needs to look like. And in order to get there, I have to cheat in these ways that I know are going to probably shorten my career. I mean, not that you're thinking that when you're 15, but that are going to injure me, because I've been told from teachers for my whole life, I have to turn out from my hips. And yet hips don't really do that, or not everyone's hips do that. So in order to succeed, you have to either win the genetic lottery or cheat in a number of ways in order to get the line. And the line is something they talked about in that article that I was just referring to in the New York Times recently. The line is something that is an illusion of reach and length and all of these things that I think are coded ways to say thinness, because the line is interrupted by hips and breasts and things like that. So, you know, these are all really designed, I think, mostly to, I don't know whose aesthetics they fit, but it's a very outdated, I think, way of thinking about ethereal waif-like women. And ethereal and waif-like as something that you're striving towards, you know, those are words that have absolutely no power. So women who are striving for that are then not thinking about ways that they could reclaim their power. That's just not a line of thinking that I was ever encouraged to do. So things like choreography or teaching or making movement my own or individuality in body, you know, a lot of injuries I think come from forcing things that you're not, you know, forcing movement, forcing lines that you're not born with. In terms of the gender dynamics, I say this a lot in the book, but all of the parts of ballet, you know, ballet is interesting as an art form because there's nothing that lasts. Now we have recording, but even recording doesn't really capture what happens on a stage. So you know, you can notate it so that the choreography is written down, but usually the choreography is just sort of passed from, you know, one choreographer to a dancer to another dancer. It just sort of changes as the body changes. There's no manuscript, there's no score, you know, there's no painting, there's just nothing that is permanent about ballet. It's like this constant vanishing point is what I say in the book. So all of the part that does last, which is choreography, I don't know, company history, things like that, is historically men. The dancers themselves have no contribution that lasts. Like, you know, thinking about, I think yesterday or something was Maria Tallchief's birthday, and she was sort of the first American ballerina. She was married to George Balanchine, among lots of other women who were also married to George Balanchine. But, you know, like, I don't know what she danced like. I can look at pictures of her. If there are recordings, I could see those, but her contributions to ballet just seem to have evaporated. So that is something that is particular to women. They are the tools of the expression. I mean, there are male dancers as well, and this is true of them too, but men can also be choreographers and teachers, whereas that is a very new idea that women can take on those kinds of roles in ballet companies.
So one woman who did was someone who lived in Santa Barbara for a time at least, Martha Graham. And you do mention her in the book. And I know there's some personal kind of resonance there. Do you want to say a little bit about her? I don't know if you want to read that passage or if you just want to kind of say what she has meant to you as a dancer and
Yeah.
beyond.
I mean, so Martha Graham, I guess disclaimers about Martha Graham, she also had a very particular aesthetic, which was, you know, now what I would certainly say is that it's racist. She did not have Black and brown dancers in her company. But one thing she did do that ballet couldn't do was take women off point, which was major, because also, I mean, that's another part of, to me, what disempowers women in ballet is that you're literally on a pedestal of your own feet, and that's really hard on your body to put all your weight on one toe. Anyway, she took women off point. She wanted women to dance. She wanted her dancers in general to dance, you know, like in different ways. She sort of made up movement that I think her own body probably, you know, she loved dance. She was not going to do what ballet asked of her. So she just invented an entire vocabulary of dance, which was really revolutionary at the time. And a lot of modern dance now is based on, you know, what Graham invented. The personal connection is just that I got obsessed when I started taking modern dance as an adult with finding out. I knew she lived in Santa Barbara, but I really wanted to find out where she lived here. And nobody seemed to know, you know, in the dance world. And so finally, my mom and I went to the Historical Museum library and looked at old records. And I found out that her family lived on Della Vina, but then she went to Santa Barbara High School, and you can, look at her yearbook picture. She was in the yearbook, or she was on the club. I guess she was in the club who made the yearbook. But she grew up 2 blocks from where I grew up. So then I felt like I was like, I knew I was drawn to her for some reason. I was like, my house was the house that I grew up in, must have been there when she was there, because it's a really old house. And we probably took walks by each other's houses all the time, and were separated by years. But I had felt drawn to this idea that you could reinvent vocabulary, because the original language did not work for you, did not apply to you, injured you, didn't, was insufficient to say the things that you wanted to say, which is how I felt after this injury that I just read about in ballet. I just felt like ballet was excluding me, by making demands of me that I think I say in the book that I just wasn't prepared to consent to. I was too young to consent to those demands.
It's interesting you use words like vocabulary and other words that I associate with writing. And I'm wondering, because you make comparisons of writing and dance, of sentences and line, and certainly in writing, you are the agent of creation, and it lasts. It's very different from what you describe as being a dancer. Do you want to talk a little bit about that shift and the connections you feel between writing and dance, if there are any?
Yeah, no, there are so many. And I think you really hit on what writing gave me that dance couldn't. I always felt like, especially after that particular injury, but I grew up being injured. I always had this story in my head that I was injury prone, that I just got injured more than other people. Maybe that's true. Maybe my body had a certain amount of turnout that I was forcing, or my feet were not right, or, those kinds of things. But those all seem so trivial. But I think that I grew up with this anxiety that as long as my body held out, I would have something to say. And as soon as something gave out, a broken back in my case, but anything gave out, that I would no longer have anything to say, that I would vanish, because this art form that I had spent my entire childhood and adolescence and early adulthood striving for and yearning for so badly just had no room for me in it. And writing was something that, I grew up, like, I played piano, and I think that I was drawn to other art, although piano felt more like something my parents made me do. But
A lot of people say that.
I'm glad in retrospect that I had that. But my parents are teachers, and I think writing was something that felt like something I always enjoyed doing. It was not something that I particularly had ambitions around. But as soon as I injured myself, I was in a college dance program and thought, like, what other classes do I like? And I just thought about this poetry class that I was taking. And that's funny now, because I've never written poetry probably since I was a freshman in college. But I remember getting an A+ on some poem that I wrote, and thinking, like, maybe I do have a voice in something else. Maybe this is an opportunity to find out what other voice I could have. And it was that voice that really saved my life. I mean, that's what it felt like. It felt like this voice that could emerge from an art form that demanded totally different things of me, that didn't feel harmful. I mean, writing felt instead like I could grow into it, rather than I was already becoming too old for it at age 19 or whatever I was. I just felt like I was running out of time to dance, and yet I could grow into the voice that I was able to have as a writer. And that felt like the anxiety just lifted.
And you just talked about feeling that you would vanish, that somehow your relevance in the world, or your ability to have a voice, would go away if you didn't have the body to dance. And you also talk a lot about, in this book, about a kind of self-erasure and not eating, and measuring your success by whether you could exist on a piece of watermelon and a glass of water. And I'm trying to think, there's a passage that you write about, and you're quoting, and I don't know how to say her name, Hilda Bruck,
Mhm. That's definitely.
in The Golden Cage, that starving ourselves is an act of self-assertion for women. And we punish ourselves for taking care of our own hungers, our own weakness, our own humanness. Can you talk a little bit more about that? How starvation can become an act of self-assertion, or how you
Well,
felt it could at that time?
yeah, in ballet, this is again the ballet logic that we were talking about, where it has its own set of logic that makes absolutely no sense, as many years removed as I am now. But part of fitting the mold that I saw had to do with being pretty much emaciated. And I was in a dance program in college that, I went to college for ballet, which was a compromise I made with my parents. I wanted to audition for companies or go to Juilliard at least, and they were like, you have to go to college. This is, which I'm so glad they did in retrospect, but I just thought like how cruel that my parents are forcing me to go to college. But in this college dance program, there were a lot of really talented dancers. It was like, well regarded in the country, which is why I went there. And one way to stand out among just a sea of talent was to be the thinnest, because I knew that I wasn't going to be the best. I knew that I wasn't going to be the star in terms of talent. But I knew that I could be thin. Like that was one thing that I could certainly control. And that felt like asserting myself and showing how much I wanted this. Like I was earning my place there every time I skipped a meal. Um, and really what, I know now happened is that my bones got brittle, and I was weak, and I was starving. I was dying. I was single digit weight or sorry, double digit weight. And it was, one of the worst times of my whole life. It was really a dark time for me. Um, but I felt like I was really good at ballet. That was when I got the most compliments. That was when I got, the most attention from teachers. And I felt like I can finally do this. I'm finally going to go somewhere with all of this. And when I injured myself, it was just like none of it was worth it. None of what I put myself through and what was rewarded and encouraged in class added up to anything. It all just added up to a lot of anxiety, a waste of time, a waste of health, a waste of life.
It's interesting that you felt this competition that you've mentioned several times, and within that core of ballerinas, with whom I should say, I'm sure you spent the majority of your time. Were there friendships, or was the dynamic more one of competition? And I know there's an episode in the book that you write about. I don't know if you might want to read that, where there's a direct, not almost, act of violence in a sense, from a fellow ballerina that
Yeah.
further changes.
Yeah, I'm happy to read that. I have that dog-eared. It's something I could read. But I will say, uh, I think that competition gets a lot of airtime because that's where the drama is, a narrative. When we think about dance schools, we think about girls like undermining each other in all of these really terrible ways. But the dance friendships I've had have been among the closest and most sustaining of my life. And that's predominantly my memory of ballet, is having really, really close friendships. Like when I think back to high school, all of my closest friends in high school were people I danced with rather than people in my high school. And anyway, so yeah, I think that just friendship is a little more boring for a dance memoir. When you're trying to get across like this was a culture I needed to leave. But I am still very good friends with, people that I danced with, and kind of feel like I'll probably never have friendships that close again, because when you're with each other for 6 hours every single day and you all have one common goal, which is like putting on the Nutcracker, or the spring, whatever the spring show is, or whatever, um, that's hugely like helpful to have sort of intimate relationships in. But yeah, do you want me to read that?
Um, if Sure, I think we have time. If that's something you'd like to read,
Sure, I'm happy to do it. We're kind
sure.
of a little bit more than halfway through. Um, Okay, so what I'm about to read this also, I mean, this all took place in Santa Barbara because I grew up in Santa Barbara. But I was in a dance school in Santa Barbara, and these two dancers came from Russia, one from the Bolshoi and one from the Kirov, to stage Don Quixote, the ballet, with my company. Their names are Sayat and Olga, and I got the part of Cupid in the ballet, which was like well, it wasn't my first solo because I was Clara in the Nutcracker. That was my first solo, but my second solo. Okay, so the very small costume I was to wear as Cupid smelled like cigarette smoke and had small gauzy wings. Upstairs, above the studio, the seamstress and Olga pulled the fabric away from my skin. "Is too big here," Olga said, "and not big enough here." I stood on a stool and turned around, and then when I stepped down, they looked at my measurements with genuine concern. The costume mistress pinned me in, and I told myself that although the pins made the costume feel tight, by the performance I'd make sure it was loose again by losing some weight. I wanted to be able to take a full breath and see folds of fabric over my sternum when I exhaled. My costume, I realized, must fit for the ballet to go on. Without my costume, we could not have my scene, and without my scene, there would be no performance. Caitlin tried it on after and showed me the places where it was too big for her, even after it was pinned for me. I should say Caitlin is my understudy. This is not a story where someone crashes or falls or is beat up. This is a story where Caitlin pushed her hands into my feet each day until one day she sat on them instead, and I didn't protest. After all, I wanted them to curve toward the floor like a body bends against the cold. When Caitlin sat, there was a gentle and slow crack. We were sitting in the hallway before a class in our rubber pants, and the girls around us heard it too. They all lay on their backs with their legs in the air or pushed against a wall, forcing their stretches a little more. There were bodies everywhere, and they all froze for the second when we heard the crack inside my foot, and then the second was a long time passing. "Oops," Caitlin said, dramatically grimacing, her hands covering my feet. I was silent and focused inward or downward to the sharp and steady pain in my right foot, and began counting how many days were left until our performance, to assure myself that I would recover in time to dance the role of Cupid. I had accepted violence from Caitlin and inflicted it on myself. "That's okay," I told everyone. "It's my fault. I asked her to. It will be fine." I was cheerful, insistent, near tears. People stood and the air moved wildly around us all. Someone handed me a bag of ice and wrapped it around my foot with a leg warmer. From inside the studio, the slow music of the Grand Allegro at the end of another class hung in the light. Caitlin was Cupid that night in our rehearsal, dancing my part as I watched from the floor. Although she knew each step, I knew she was not as good as I was and would never be allowed to dance that part. Bodies were the enemy, after all, whether they belonged to us or to the girls we danced alongside. We competed for Sayat's halting, accented praise, for Olga's eyes to trace us as we danced. We were two women competing for one role. My foot didn't swell immediately, but by the time I unwrapped it in front of Olga after rehearsal, it was round and hot. Her eyes darted around, searching the room for a solution. I saw the wisps of hair at the nape of her neck when she turned her head from side to side, and in her face and her form was something I had not seen before. It looked like pride. I learned from her face the necessity of sacrificing the body to contort it into something perfect. The room was mostly dark, but for a few overhead lights buzzing, streaming over our heads and then down to the floor. She leaned over me in the semi-dark, and I knew she wanted me to give my life to ballet right then, as she had done, to be tougher than physical pain, to dance anyway. With my foot still in her lap, I lay down on the floor, submitting.
There's so much in that. That's the complexity of that relationship and the complexity of your own feeling about your body. You said our body is the enemy, right? Is that the phrase that you used?
Mm-hmm.
Is so devastating, really.
I
A lot
know.
of this book I found when I read it, I literally would find tears in my eyes, and I never danced because I felt so sad for young you. It was just this, and I wonder, and then I'll turn to questions from the audience, but did you feel that when you were writing this? Because the story has multiple strands, not just dance, but could you feel compassion for that?
Yeah.
You those
I
choices?
felt like I was able to see that the ways that I felt that I had failed as a dancer, the shame I felt around wanting something so badly and not being able to achieve it, putting everything I had into a goal, when I always grew up hearing, if you work really hard at something, you can achieve that. And that just was never going to be true. I felt like I realized in writing this that it was a system stacked against, any single dancer, that there was no way that unless you won what I said earlier, the genetic and socioeconomic lottery, that you can, be the dancer you want to be. So, well, that's not true. There are people who accomplish that, but there was no way that I was going to. And I also saw this, I think the reason I wanted to write this book was because I realized how much ballet was representative of what I think a lot of women feel: not good enough, not feminine enough, not waif-like enough, not acquiescent enough. The things that we think we need to be in order to be obedient women are actually detrimental to us having any kind of authorship over our own life. And that's a really hard lesson to learn. And I think that, whether you dance or not, a lot of people learn that lesson in really painful ways. So I think, that's when you said something in the introduction about the universal and the personal story of ballet, I was hoping would have universal resonance for anybody who has ever felt like they were not good enough at something.
Yeah, it's very poignant. And I like the fact you use the word authorship, because you've certainly grabbed that power in being an author. And let me give someone else a chance to ask you a question. I'll turn to our Q&A section. And this is someone who is a dancer. I identify myself as a dancer, hurt my back a few months ago. It's intensely humbling, and I'm determined to dance again. Now calculating my daily routines and not dancing, I always felt like I was 18 years old. How do we emotionally and psychologically cope as we try hard to heal and not feeling 18 any longer?
No, I know it's so hard to come back when you're not 18 to be in dance shape. I think one thing that's been really hard for me dancing as an adult is letting go of what I used to be able to do that I can no longer do. Like, I'm not going to be in the studio often enough. And also I'm just not flexible enough or, I guess athletic enough anymore to do some of those things. So to me, like, letting go of the arabesque that I used to have and just thinking, if I can get my leg behind me and off the ground, then that's actually what the movement is. It's just, an arabesque is your leg behind you. It doesn't have to be, up so that it's like your foot's in line with your head. I could do that when I was 18, and I can't do it now. And I'm probably never going to be able to do that again. I don't know. I guess just a lot of grace and a lot of gratitude that your body has been able to dance as long as it has. I am so grateful to my body that it had that experience. And every time I do dance, I'm grateful that I can dance at all. It is a little bit sad. I mean, I say in the book, when I went to my first modern class, and I think my modern teacher is here. She told me she was going to be here. She asked me something about my background in dance, just as I was getting ready. And I said something kind of jokey, like, I can't do ballet anymore because it would be like being married to somebody that I used to date. I can't do ballet casually, or sorry, dating someone I used to be married to. I can't do ballet casually anymore. So, I would also say, like, if you're a dancer with an injury, there are other kinds of dance that maybe don't demand the body part that's injured. And those can be really wonderful. And you don't have the same expectations of yourself if they're new to you. So that was major for me. I don't know.
Yeah.
Not feeling 18. Like, I don't have a modern dance idea of myself at age 18, really. That doesn't exist. So I can just reinvent it.
Reinvention is seemingly important. It comes up in the book as well. So here's a question from Sarah. The origins of ballet must have defined the first sense of what was required in line and body type. Was there enormous dropout as young, lithe girls could no longer bear the extremes, thus setting the foundation, as you mentioned, that women are eternally replaceable?
Yeah, I I remember in elementary school, a lot of girls danced. I mean, I can remember in my class being one of like four. And by the time I was in high school, I was the ballet dancer in my high school class. And certainly in ballet class, there were a lot of people who left throughout the years. And now I understand why. At the time, it just felt like they didn't have what it took, or they weren't committed enough. But they were committed to something, maybe they weren't committed enough to like injuring themselves in order to uh, do well or get the parts, or they wanted to do something else. Ballet is really, really time consuming and really, really expensive. And these are all things that I just didn't think about because, my parents didn't talk to me about that. They made it work. I know how much they sacrificed now in order to give me dance lessons that meant so much to me. But yeah, I saw girls drop off, and maybe I did feel like I was replaceable, or that, there was sort of a sloughing off of people who couldn't make it, who didn't have what it took. But what it took was, everything.
Yeah.
And some people just aren't willing to give everything, and good for them.
And then someone else asks, kind of referring back to what we spoke about earlier, given the global Me Too awareness and the focus on empowering women, could you speculate on why there have been no innovators in ballet to push back on its most destructive aspects, beginning in young classrooms and trainings?
Well, there have been some people. There has been, I think ballet certainly underwent a big Me Too reckoning, as the culture did. It was during that the director of the longtime artistic director of New York City Ballet, who inherited that company from George Balanchine, had to resign amidst scandal that had to do with him being verbally and emotionally abusive, or sorry, physically and emotionally abusive to his dancers. He had domestic violence, investigation allegations from his ex-wife. And then also New York City Ballet had like a kind of like a revenge porn scandal as well, that I won't go into because it's a little bit convoluted. But there was a lot written about that, and there was a lot of reimagining what ballet could look like so that those kinds of things didn't happen. We're certainly not there. I still think that in a lot of cases, ballet studios can be really powerful places for little kids. I mean, dance communities are really tight knit and can be really nurturing, but I think that you have to know what you're looking for in order to find a healthy environment for your own child or for yourself. So there are people innovating. It's just really slow. I mean, it's really slower than the rest of the culture. And part of it is that gatekeepers, I think, are losing their power, but haven't totally lost it yet. Like they haven't totally been ousted. And then it makes dancers sort of reticent to talk to the press about their perhaps abusive experiences because they don't want to lose their place or, alienate their boss. So yeah, that's happening, but I want it to happen faster.
And then in a way, this is related to what you say about finding the right place. Someone asks, did you enjoy dancing? And did you see that as a way of expressing yourself for the sheer joy of it? Do other dancers do that for specific joy, or is the only joy to be found being the lead dancer?
No, I definitely loved it and found joy in it. And I talk about that a lot in the book. And that's unfortunately something that doesn't always come up in interviews because I have my soapbox and I want to talk about the ways that ballet can be really damaging, but ballet can be hugely joyful because any kind of movement is joyful, and expression, to music. There's so much satisfaction in learning a piece, especially as part of a group of people. I still to this day feel almost high when I'm in any kind of dance class when we're all doing the same thing at the same time. Even sometimes in a yoga class, I feel that way. But the idea that you all learn one piece of choreography, you hear the same music, your bodies all look different, you're interpreting it differently, but you're all somehow doing something in sync is an experience I don't think we often get as humans. And it's only joyful. I mean, I guess my ambitions around ballet or around dancing have mostly vanished, and I just want to get through it and have fun and have community. So that certainly exists. And I felt that as a child as well. It's just, the more and more constraints I felt, I think the joy got squeezed out of the experience more and more. But an important part, I think, of dancing is being able to reclaim that or never lose it to begin with.
And then switching gears, someone asks, what are the top 3 pieces of advice that you would give someone wanting to write a book or a memoir specifically? So a different kind of craft.
Oh, okay. So I would say read every memoir that comes out, read them to figure out how they're structured, what part of the story is being told, what part of the story is not being told. Read widely, don't be snobby in your reading, read curiously. And my second piece of advice would be to figure out both your entry point and your end point for the book, because memoir is really tricky. You have your entire life as your material, so you could really start it and end it anywhere. And I found it really hard to end this book. And in fact, I realized that I needed to do certain things in order to finish the story that I was living out. Like I couldn't write until I had finished living the story. So figuring out your beginning and your end. And then, can I just say reading a lot of memoir again? I think that reading is the most important thing, but structure, and then I would say maybe sentences, figuring out like sort of a set of vocabulary. I wrote with a lot of dance and flight and those kinds of things in this, because even when I wasn't writing about dance, I wanted this to be so much about the experience of living as a dancer, somebody who was trained as a dancer and thinks of myself as a dancer, even though I haven't danced at all during COVID and haven't danced leading up to that. I was 7 months pregnant when lockdown started, so didn't dance during my pregnancy either. So it's been a long time. But I still think of myself so much as a dancer, like the way I stretch in the morning and those kinds of things. So figuring out like a vocabulary that you can use, or sort of a central anchoring metaphor that you can use around whatever the story it is you want to tell. There has to be something that's tying it all together. So figuring out what that is and then writing around it, picking scenes around that anchoring metaphor.
And then Patricia says, you had to give up ballet, but have successfully moved to writing a touching story. What's next for you?
That's the nice thing about writing is just more writing. I'm not going to outgrow writing. I'm just starting to work on something new right now. Because this came out almost a year ago. This book came out April 7th. And then I had a baby in May. So I have written some things since then, but it's like the come down from the book, having a newborn, and then also COVID has made a lot of things just feel like survival mode. But I'm starting to get into a new project that I've talked to Patsy a little bit about saints, women saints, and their bodily manifestations of their faith and motherhood, the tying together of those two things. So that's next. But I teach at UCSB, so I always have that on the horizon, and I always have a few writing projects that I'm thinking about.
So you talk about having a baby, and one of the things you write about very beautifully is the relationship, the mother-daughter relationship with your mother, and how much you have turned to her and how wonderful she's been. So someone else asks, many young women have eating disorders and even contests to see who can be thinnest, and they're not dancers. Do you have any words for them or their mothers who suffer watching their precious girls disappearing?
Well, I'm so sorry if people are watching their girls disappear. That's really hard. And, eating disorders are one of those things that I don't think ever fully vanish. It's like an addiction. It's like something you have to work against every day. One of the things that was really helpful for me that I have a chapter about in this book, in sort of the healing from all the dance trauma, is how much time I realized I could save by not worrying so much about how I looked, like not counting calories, not trying to have fitness goals and food goals, like just how time consuming that was and what else I could do with my time that felt much better, much more joyful. Um, Thinking about it, like even now, I remember my agent reading a draft of this said something like, you know, I thought about like only having half my sandwich for lunch, and then I read this chapter and realized like, no, because I'll be more powerful, I'll be able to do more work, I'll be able to do more things I love if I just eat the damn sandwich. And I think encouraging our daughters to, and you know, and I think about mine too, and I pray that this is not something that I confront, but it is common, um, to think about all all the things that you love that you wouldn't have time to do if you're counting your calories. You know, if you're singularly devoted to this addiction of disappearing, um, and how just time consuming that is. And what a boring use of your time. I mean, really, what mark can you leave on the world if that's what you're doing? And yet everybody, you know, knows somebody or has dealt with it themselves.
Yeah. In the final paragraph of the book, you write about finding calm. You use that word calm. Can you describe what that looks like and how you got there?
Yeah, that was a word that my phobia, I went to a therapist specifically to deal with a phobia of snakes. And that was the word that he taught me, or he actually told me to choose my own word, but to give myself a command when I felt like I was thinking about snakes or worried that I would see a snake. You know, it got to the point where it wasn't even hiking. It was like taking the trash out. I'd get worried that, you know, like in my downtown Santa Barbara house that I would see a snake, which was illogical, but that's how fear and phobias are. So calm was the command I gave myself. And I had to do a lot of like body training to associate that word with total body relaxation. I still do sometimes use that word as a command to myself if I feel that I'm stressed. You know, the whole point of that command had to do with feeling the tension in your body and knowing like I carry tension in my neck or in my hands or my jaw or wherever we do. So focusing on that and giving yourself the command and having that command really associated with, you know, dropping your shoulders or releasing your jaw. It's really helpful. I mean, I think phobia exposure therapy is what it's called, can be really scary because we focus on the exposure, but the exposure I was able to choose. And that was kind of a moving target. At first, I just wanted to be able to like hear the word and not, you know, freak out about it. And then eventually I thought, well, no, I can progress to seeing a picture and not freaking out. And then suddenly I was like, I think I could even see one or touch one. And touching one was like the moment where I was like, you know, I'll probably never have to touch a snake involuntarily. So like I've overcome the thing. But if anyone's ever worried about exposure therapy, that's really in your hands. You know how much you want to be exposed, and giving yourself that kind of command and teaching yourself to relax your body is like the greatest gift I've ever gotten.
I think there's so much in this book that we relate to from different perspectives, but things that we've gone through, and hearing you say that is very reassuring. As someone else asked, you know, what are the long-term effects for you from all this, and how do you cope with it? And I think you've answered that beautifully. And the last question that came in is the book available at the museum store? Yes. And this is for you. Would it be possible to get a signed copy? Is there a way we might do that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Chaucer's has it as well, but I have not signed any because, as I said, it came out in a time when in-person events were out of the question. But yeah, I'm happy to sign.
Great. Well, I think our hour has passed. And as one Irish woman to another, I have to say, as you think about, you end with your comment about snakes, and tomorrow is St. Patrick's Day, and he did drive the snakes out of Ireland. So maybe
Oh yeah, that's right.
in some way we've come full
Full
circle.
circle as Irish women.
Yeah, but this was a wonderful conversation,
Thank you so
a
much for
beautiful
having
book.
me.
I truly feel that everybody who was commenting tonight and all of us who have read it have that sense of a story well told that really does connect to many of our own experiences. And I'm just so glad that the book is here, that your daughter is here, and most importantly, that you're here tonight and talking to us. And I can't wait for the Saints. Looking forward to our next possibility of doing this. And thank you to everyone who is reading the book, is thinking about all these questions about all art forms and all institutions behind them and the ways that they might change and be better. And Ellen, I just thank you for the honesty of this book and the beauty of the writing, and for the way you share your newfound powers with the rest of us who strive to write and love to read. So thanks to you, and thanks to everyone for being here. And Elena Hancock, we thank you for being the magic hands behind the Zoom. So that's it. I'll say good night. And again, thanks to all.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, bye-bye.